As my high school graduation approached nearer and nearer every day, in May of 1968, so that gives you some idea how long ago, I grew more and more anxious. Primarily because so many people were reminding me of my mother's death and reminding me of the expectations she had of her children, and hoping that I would live up to those expectations, and reminding me of what a grand woman she was, and she was a grand woman, and so on and so forth. And my anxiety just kept building because I was supposed to give the senior speech. I was president of the senior class, and so the valedictorian, the salutatorian, and the president of the senior class was to provide a speech to emphasize what we had accomplished and what we were going to do with our lives. And the reason the anxiety grew was, to be truthful, I had spent 6 years trying to make sense of her death because it didn't make sense to me. And 2.5 years of that, I have to be very clear now that I know about these things, were spent in severe teenage depression. And so I just come out of all of that. And now I was being reminded of that very sorrowful moment in life. And then these high expectations that all mothers, I think, have of their children. But my mother certainly had those expectations. But it was even magnified more completely because I had the anxiety that I was beginning to lose a sense of who she was, and was afraid that I was beginning to have amnesia about the kind of person she was. And it manifested itself by reminding myself I couldn't remember what her voice sounded like. And shared that with my 2 uncles, my mother's brothers. They had taken me to a wonderful old Jewish tailor so that I would be properly fitted for my first real suit. I had always had hand-me-downs from my brother Gene, and at graduation one of my gifts was an actual suit that was going to fit me, just me. And so I was excited about that. But I poured out my heart to them as I'm being measured up for this suit, and told them I keep forgetting her. I'm losing sight of her, and I've forgotten her voice. And I was very glad that my Uncle Roy and my Uncle Vern, both of them were really sensitive old guys, and my Uncle Roy remembered that at a party some years before, they had made a vinyl recording of their party. Okay, in those days there was actually a machine that you could take the needle, and you could put it on a vinyl disc. Any of you old enough to remember how those things worked? And you could actually record what was going on in the room, and they had recorded this party. And just before my graduation, as a pre-gift, my uncle came in and brought that vinyl disc and said, "This is for you." And suddenly, out of all of that scratching, crackling stuff that were vinyl recordings, came my mother's contralto voice singing, "In your Easter bonnet with all the frills upon it." It was this funny little song, but it was her voice. And then there was a perfectly awful duet with my Uncle Roy. But one of the things they did do as they sang duets together is they always modulated off key together. So, And then there was my mother's voice, just itself, telling a funny little story. And I knew, again, suddenly, this was that person. The Bible has a word for that voice. For all of our voices, it's phone, from which you get the word telephone. It means the sound of someone's voice. And this is what Jesus is reminding people of when he talks about being the Good Shepherd. To hear that voice again, to know that voice, was to find strength and courage and remember who she was, and also to have that sense of all the wonderful expectations she had of us as children. The adolescent church, which is the time period of Jesus, of John's gospel, is going through the same anxiety when John writes this story about the Good Shepherd. John is already very old, and the church is already beginning to forget the sound of Jesus' voice. And the story of the Good Shepherd is to remind those who follow Jesus that the voice is never fully forgotten. In the Middle East, just as Mary was saying, the shepherds there know their sheep so well that they call them by name, first of all, and then when they lead them, and they always lead their sheep from the front, not from behind, but from the front, they call them by name, and the sheep, by and large, are fairly obedient, unlike Presbyterian church members. Those sheep know the shepherd's voice and come to that shepherd only. You can literally have hundreds of sheep in a herd, and the shepherds can begin calling out their sheep, and the sheep will only come to that shepherd. I watched this, Janie and I watched this with the Bedouins when we were in Israel. As they sorted out their flocks, the sheep know the shepherd's voice, and they come to him. And John is trying to remind people that in this sorting out time of the church, that they must stay attuned to Jesus' voice. Now, once I say that, you have to understand there's no way that we can have a physical recording of Jesus' voice. But Jesus' voice still can be heard, because there are other ways, the Bible tells us, about how that voice comes to us. One of them is logos. The word is spoken. Jesus is the word incarnate. And logos means the thinking process, the way in which Jesus thought. The mind of Jesus is recorded in the scriptures, and we get how he thought about things as they're recorded by the gospel writers. That's one way we know his voice. A second way is we know that many of the Bible's words of Jesus are his exact words, and those we call rhema, meaning literally the sayings of Jesus, the kinds of things he said. And then there's onama, which is the way in which Jesus acted, putting his words into action. And if you take all three of those, even though you may not know the sound of his voice, the physical voice, you can know that this is a sound teaching and voice of Jesus coming to you. Did you doubt that? You're tired. Life has come at you at a strong and difficult pace. Life seems to be overwhelming you, and you need help. And out of the background of your own brain and that mind of Christ that is in you, you hear, "Come, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am gentle and humble of heart." Do you hear the voice? You know that's how Jesus spoke to people. And in those times of your life when you're not exactly being the disciple and follower that Jesus wants you to be, and you're in a royal snit at somebody, and you're angry and frustrated and feeling particularly unforgiving, the voice comes. If you spend any time in Sunday school or in the teaching of your parents, the voice comes, doesn't it? First from the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And then when you're still in that royal snit, okay, the voice comes again, and you're saying, well, just exactly how many times do I have to forgive somebody? And you know what the voice says, don't you? 70 times 7? And you know it's his voice. Because you know he's teaching. You know not only his mind or thought about these things, but you also know in your heart of hearts the very words that he spoke, because your Sunday school teachers have been teaching you those verses for a long time. And so they come to you at critical moments when you need to know in your life, what is it that Jesus would have us be and do? And then someone walks into the church one day and says, I'm cold and I'm hungry. And you're feeling frustrated and you don't have time for that. But the voice comes, right? If you have a coat, give it to him. If he's hungry, feed him. So we do know the voice, don't we? We may not know the exact sound, whether he was a bass or a tenor, but we know deep down inside ourselves that that voice is real, and we mustn't forget it, John says. Some years ago, an experiment was done on babies. Psychologists have to work out doctoral program things. And so one of the students decided, I wonder if babies know their mother's voice. Okay. So the psychologist got a bunch of mothers together, a bunch of babies together, and put the mothers in a certain order, and then had different mothers calling their children, calling the children by name. Do you know what happened? Do you know about this study? 95% of the babies picked out their mother, even though they couldn't see them. They could hear the voice, but couldn't see them. So then this burgeoning young psychologist tried another experiment. What happens when children are separated from their biological mothers and raised by someone else? Is there any identification that stays over? Well, what she discovered was not so much. Then the thought came to her, what happens if you hook up the electrodes to the brain that is part of memory? Is there any response at all? Do you know what happened? Yeah. 80% of those children who had not been raised by their biological mothers responded with electrical synapse kind of movement. They didn't know consciously their biological mothers, but they responded subconsciously to the voice that they had heard while she was carrying them in the womb. And I'm sharing this with the graduates today to tell you, you may go straying afar from First Presbyterian Church, and you may go straying afar from your families, and you may go straying afar in college from all of those things you learned, but that voice will come. Okay? There will be times when you feel like you're out there all alone by yourself, and you will hear the shepherd's voice. But most assuredly, you will hear your parents. And be assured of that. You will know that voice. And you will know when you leave here that you will always have a home here in this place where all are welcome. And certainly you're always welcome in the household of God that raised you up. You may even run off and be Baptist someplace, but you'll be Presbyterian in your heart all the days of your life. Listen to the voice of Jesus. He has taught us love and forgiveness. He has taught us care and concern for others. And if you ever find yourself in a place dark and far from home, you will hear him say to you, "There once was a man who had 2 sons, and one of them went off to a far land and wasted his life away. And then he came to himself and remembered his father. And he said, I shall rise up and go home." And that will be the voice of the shepherd, guiding you and directing you. For there is no place on the face of this earth and no place in the cosmos where the Good Shepherd does not dwell. That's what Psalm 139 says. Be attentive to the voice and remember the teachings of Jesus and of your mothers and of your fathers and of your church and your Sunday school teachers. And if you can't remember them, at least remember the voice of Reverend Bill who says, "I want you back here." Blessings and peace to you as you go and make another whole new life for yourselves. Amen.